There's a moment, you've probably had it, where you're standing at a sink, hands under running water, reaching for a bar of soap without even thinking about it. It's automatic, reflexive, like breathing. And that's exactly why this story is so easy to miss. Because the thing sitting next to your faucet right now, that unassuming bar, that plastic bottle of liquid you bought for $2, that object has one of the strangest, most consequential histories of anything humans have ever made. It was invented for the wrong reasons, used for the wrong things, weaponized by empires. And for most of human history, the people who made it were some of the most powerful and most despised figures in the ancient world. Here's something that stops most people cold when they first hear it. For the majority of human history, soap was not used to clean human bodies. Not even close. It was an industrial product, a manufacturing tool, and the idea that you should rub it on your skin and rinse it off every day. That came shockingly late, and when it finally did arrive, it didn't come packaged as health advice. It came packaged as ideology. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back, way back, to a time before plumbing, before germ theory, before the very concept of personal hygiene as we understand it today. Because the story of soap doesn't begin in a bathroom. It begins in a place you'd never expect, somewhere between a slaughterhouse and a textile workshop, in the ancient cities of Mesopotamia, where someone, thousands of years ago, accidentally discovered that fat and ash, when combined under heat, produced something that could cut through grease in a way that water alone never could. That accidental discovery, so simple, so unglamorous, would eventually travel across continents, reshape trade empires, spark wars over ingredients, and become the centerpiece of one of the most effective and disturbing propaganda campaigns in modern history. By the end of this video, you're going to look at that bar of soap very differently. Not because it's sinister, but because it's a mirror, and what it reflects back at us is a story about power, about whose bodies were considered clean and whose weren't, about how a civilization decides what it means to be modern, civilized, or even fully human. All from something you touched this morning without a second thought. Let's start at the beginning. The oldest evidence we have of soap, or something very much like it, comes from ancient Mesopotamia. Around 2800 BCE, archaeologists digging through the ruins of what is now modern Iraq found clay cylinders inscribed with a recipe. The instructions described boiling fats together with wood ash and water. The result was a substance that could clean wool and cotton fibers before they were woven into cloth. Not skin wool. That distinction matters more than it might seem at first. The earliest soap wasn't a hygiene product. It was a textile product. And that tells us something fundamental about how the ancient world thought about cleanliness, which is to say, they thought about it almost entirely differently than we do. The Mesopotamians were sophisticated in ways that still astonish historians. They built cities, developed writing, created legal codes, and they absolutely cared about cleanliness, but cleanliness for them was primarily a ritual concept, not a medical one. You bathed before entering a temple. You washed your hands before a sacrifice. The goal was ritual purity, separation from the sacred and the profane, not the removal of bacteria that, as far as anyone in 2800 BCE was concerned, didn't exist. So soap sat in workshops, not bathrooms. It cleaned the raw material that would become clothing, rope, and fabric. It was a craftsman's tool. Now across the ancient Mediterranean, a very similar discovery was being made independently. The Egyptians have left us records describing a substance made from animal and vegetable oils combined with alkaline salts, used for treating skin diseases and for washing. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical documents ever found, dating to around 1550 BCE, mentions a soap-like material used therapeutically, not for daily bathing, for medicine, for wounds, for skin conditions. This pattern repeats itself across cultures. Soap appears first as a functional, specialized tool for industry, for medicine, for ritual, long before anyone thinks to use it as a daily personal hygiene product. The Romans are a fascinating case here because they are often held up as the gold standard of ancient cleanliness. And in some ways, that reputation is deserved. The Romans built elaborate public bathhouses, thermae, that were genuine architectural marvels. Senators and slaves, at least in principle, bathed in the same facilities. The Roman bathhouse was a social institution as much as a hygienic one, a place to meet, negotiate, gossip, and be seen. But here's the part that surprises almost everyone. The Romans, for most of their history, did not use soap to bathe. They used oil. The practice was called strigeling. You would coat your body in olive oil, let it sit, and then scrape it off with a curved metal instrument called a strigil, pulling the oil, sweat, and dirt away with it. It sounds strange to us, almost counterintuitive, but it actually works remarkably well as a cleaning method, and the Romans swore by it. Soap existed in the Roman world. There's evidence of a soap factory in the ruins of Pompeii, preserved under volcanic ash when Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE. But for most Roman citizens, soap was still primarily associated with laundry and wool working, not bathing. There is actually a famous, though possibly apocryphal, story that the Romans first encountered soap as a product used by Gauls and Germanic tribes to the north, who mixed animal fat with wood ash to create a substance they used both to clean their hair and as a kind of styling product. Roman writers described it with a mixture of fascination and condescension, the way one might describe an exotic foreign custom, which tells you something about how culturally specific ideas of cleanliness really are, even within what we think of as advanced civilizations. The chemistry underneath all of this, the reason soap works at all, is something humans stumbled upon empirically thousands of years before anyone understood it scientifically. What's actually happening when you mix fat with a strong alkali, whether that's wood ash, which produces potassium hydroxide, or later sodium hydroxide, is a chemical reaction called saponification. The fat molecules are broken apart and restructured into soap molecules, which have a split personality. One end is attracted to water, the other end is attracted to oil and grease. When you rub soap on your hands, those molecules surround the grease and dirt particles, with their oily ends pointing inward toward the grease and their watery ends pointing outward. Then, when you rinse, the water carries the whole structure away. It's an elegant piece of chemistry, and no one who discovered it had any idea that's what was happening. They just knew it worked. By the time of the early medieval period in Europe, soap making had become a genuine trade. Different regions became known for different varieties. Castile soap from Spain, made with olive oil, was considered especially fine and would eventually become famous across the continent. Aleppo soap from Syria, made with laurel berry oil, had a reputation for being particularly gentle and is still produced today using methods largely unchanged from the ancient world. Marseille in southern France would eventually become one of the great soap-producing cities of the medieval Mediterranean, and the soap made there, Savon de Marseille, still carries that reputation. These regional soap traditions weren't just about recipes. They were about supply chains, about access to specific raw materials, olive oil here, animal fat there, specific types of ash from specific plants. Soap making pulled together the products of agriculture, animal husbandry, and trade into a single specialized craft. And the people who mastered that craft occupied a peculiar position in medieval society. They were essential, and yet, because their work involved animal fat and rendered grease and caustic alkalis, often looked down upon. Necessary, but not quite respectable. The soap maker was in many ways the first chemist. Working by feel, by smell, by experience passed down through generations, they were manipulating molecular structures centuries before the word molecule existed. And for most of this period, through ancient Mesopotamia, through Rome, through the medieval Mediterranean, soap remained something used by specialists, by workshops, by the wealthy who could afford imported luxury bars. The idea that ordinary people should wash their bodies with soap every day was still, extraordinarily, nowhere on the horizon. That was about to change. But the change would take longer and come from stranger directions than you might expect. By the time Europe entered the High Middle Ages, roughly the 11th and 12th centuries, soap was no longer just a craft curiosity. It was becoming an industry, and like most industries that matter, its rise was driven not by altruism or enlightenment, but by money. The great soap-producing cities of the Mediterranean, Marseille, Venice, Genoa, Savona, weren't making soap because they cared about public health. They were making soap because soap meant profit, and the profits were extraordinary. Here's why. Soap requires two essential ingredients, fat and alkali. Fat came from animals or plants. Alkali in the early medieval world came primarily from burning specific plants and collecting their ash, a substance called barilla in Spanish, produced from coastal plants that grew around the Mediterranean basin. The regions that controlled access to quality barilla or to large supplies of olive oil or animal tallow controlled soap production. And the regions that controlled soap production held economic leverage over everyone who needed clean cloth. And everyone needed clean cloth. This is the part of the story that tends to get overlooked because we're so focused on soap as a personal hygiene product. But for most of the medieval and early modern period, the primary consumer of soap wasn't a person trying to wash their body. It was the textile industry. Wool, linen, cotton. All of it needed to be scoured, cleaned, and processed before it could be dyed and woven. Soap was as essential to the cloth trade as the looms themselves. And the cloth trade in medieval and early modern Europe was everything. It was the engine of the economy. The wool trade between England and Flanders, the silk trade through northern Italy, the linen industries of France and the Low Countries. These weren't just industries. They were the financial backbone of entire kingdoms. And running underneath all of it, quietly essential, was soap. Venice understood this better than almost anyone. The Venetian Republic, at the height of its power, was essentially a trading empire built on controlling the flow of goods through the Mediterranean. Soap fit neatly into that system, and Venetian merchants were instrumental in spreading both the product and the techniques of making it across the continent. But it was in the Islamic world that soap making, during this same period, reached its highest level of sophistication. This is a part of the story that Western histories of soap often gloss over, and it's worth slowing down here. While much of early medieval Europe was still using relatively crude soap made from animal fat and wood ash, soap makers in the Arab world, particularly in cities like Aleppo, Damascus, and later in Al-Andalus, the Muslim-ruled region of the Iberian Peninsula, had developed soap making into something approaching a fine art. They were working with olive oil and laurel oil, producing hard, precisely formulated bars with consistent quality. They had, in many historians' assessment, a significantly more sophisticated soap culture than their European contemporaries. And crucially, this is the part that matters. Islamic religious practice made personal cleanliness a genuine priority in a way that had no real equivalent in medieval Christian Europe at the time. The concept of tahara, ritual purity, required washing before prayer, after certain bodily functions, and at specific religious moments. This wasn't optional. It was embedded in religious law. And that religious imperative created sustained, consistent demand for soap as a personal hygiene product, not just an industrial one. Centuries before that concept took hold in Christian Europe, the Crusades, that bloody, complicated series of military campaigns that began in 1095 and stretched across nearly 2 centuries, brought European soldiers and pilgrims into direct contact with this more sophisticated soap culture. What they found in the cities of the Levant, in terms of bathhouses, personal cleanliness, and soap quality, was often genuinely surprising to them. Some Crusader accounts describe the local bathhouses and washing practices with undisguised admiration. Others, of course, describe them with suspicion, because cleanliness in the medieval Christian imagination had complicated associations. Too much concern with the body could be seen as vanity, even sinfulness. The soul mattered. The flesh was a distraction. That tension between cleanliness as virtue and cleanliness as vanity would run through European culture for centuries. It is, in part, why the history of soap in Europe is so much stranger and more discontinuous than you might expect. There's a persistent myth, worth addressing directly here, that medieval Europeans never bathed and lived in a state of permanent filth. That's an overstatement. Public bathhouses, called stews in England, étuves in France, existed in most major European cities throughout the medieval period, and contemporary accounts suggest they were reasonably well used. But they operated under constant moral suspicion. They were associated with prostitution, with disease, with moral laxity. And when the Black Death arrived in the mid-14th century and swept across Europe with catastrophic speed, killing somewhere between a third and half of the continent's population, bathing took a body blow it wouldn't fully recover from for centuries. The medical theory of the time, based on ancient Greek ideas about miasma and bodily humors, held that warm water opened the pores and made the body vulnerable to pestilential air. Bathing, under this theory, wasn't just unhelpful. It was actively dangerous. Physicians advised against it. The bathhouses that had been a fixture of urban life began to close. Personal washing declined sharply. This is one of history's great ironies. The very activity that we now know is one of our best defenses against the spread of infectious disease was, for a period of several centuries, widely believed to cause it. Soap didn't disappear during this period, but its role contracted back toward the industrial, toward laundry, toward textile processing, toward the specialized workshops. And it stayed there, more or less, until a series of developments in the 18th and early 19th centuries changed everything. The first was scientific. In 1791, a French chemist named Nicolas Leblanc developed an industrial process for producing soda ash, sodium carbonate, from common salt. Before Leblanc, the alkali needed for soap making came primarily from plant ash, which was expensive, inconsistent in quality, and geographically limited. The Leblanc process, for the first time, made it possible to produce alkali in essentially unlimited quantities, cheaply, and anywhere. It was a manufacturing revolution, hiding inside a chemistry paper. Then came a Frenchman named Michel Eugene Chevreul, who in the early 19th century finally worked out the actual chemistry of saponification, explaining, for the first time, exactly what was happening at a molecular level when fat reacted with alkali to produce soap. Suddenly, soap making wasn't just a craft guided by intuition. It was a science that could be optimized, standardized, scaled. And then came the Industrial Revolution itself, the factories, the steam power, the mechanization of production, which took all of that scientific knowledge and turned it into something the world had never seen before. Soap made cheaply, consistently, and in quantities large enough to supply not just workshops and wealthy households, but ordinary people. Everyone, everywhere. The price of soap collapsed. A product that had been, for much of human history, either an industrial input or a luxury good was suddenly, astonishingly, affordable. And now, for the first time, the question arose, what do you do with cheap, abundant soap? Who is it for? What is it supposed to accomplish? The answers that emerged to those questions were not simply about hygiene. They were about something much larger, about class, about race, about empire, about who counted as civilized and who didn't. That's where this story takes its darkest turn. In 1884, a British soap manufacturer named Thomas Barrett did something that would change advertising, and arguably, the course of cultural history, forever. Barrett was the marketing mind behind Pears soap, a translucent, amber-colored bar that had been produced in London since the late 18th century. Pears was a quality product, well regarded, but it occupied a relatively modest place in the British market. Barrett wanted to change that. He wanted to make Pears soap not just a product people bought, but a product people believed in, a product that meant something. So he bought a painting. The painting was called Bubbles, a sentimental portrait by the renowned artist John Everett Millais, depicting his young grandson blowing soap bubbles, gazing upward with an expression of innocent wonder. It was exactly the kind of respectable, emotionally resonant image that Victorian England adored. Barrett acquired the rights to reproduce it, added the words Pears soap to the bottom, and plastered it across newspapers, billboards, and magazines throughout Britain and its colonies. It was one of the first truly modern advertising campaigns, and it worked beyond anyone's expectations. But Barrett didn't stop there, because Pears soap wasn't just being sold to British consumers at home. It was being sold, aggressively, deliberately, to the populations of Britain's colonial territories. And the advertising language used in those markets was something else entirely. In 1899, Pears soap ran an advertisement in several major publications that included the following text, beneath an image of a British naval officer surveying a colonial landscape. The first step towards lightening the white man's burden is through teaching the virtues of cleanliness. Pears soap is a potent factor in brightening the dark corners of the earth as civilization advances. Read that again slowly, because it's worth sitting with. A soap advertisement for a bar of soap was explicitly invoking Rudyard Kipling's famous poem about the supposed duty of white Europeans to civilize the non-white world. Cleanliness and civilization were being presented as synonymous, and the product being sold was the vehicle through which that civilization would be delivered. This was not an isolated campaign. It was part of a coordinated, continent-wide cultural project. The historian Anne McClintock, in her landmark study of imperialism and culture, documented in precise detail how soap, and particularly the marketing of soap, became one of the primary mechanisms through which Victorian Britain constructed and exported its ideology of racial hierarchy. The argument, repeated endlessly across advertisements, missionary pamphlets, and colonial policy documents, went something like this: civilized people are clean. Cleanliness requires soap. Therefore, soap is civilization. And the people who do not yet use soap, the colonized peoples of Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, are not yet civilized. They need to be taught. They need our soap. They need us. It is a logic so circular it should collapse under its own weight. And yet it was extraordinarily effective, because it dressed up a project of economic extraction and political domination in the language of benevolence and hygiene. The soap companies, Pears, Lever Brothers, and others, were not reluctant participants in this ideology. They were architects of it. William Lever, the founder of Lever Brothers and the man who would eventually build one of the largest consumer goods companies in the world, the company we now know as Unilever, was himself a committed imperialist who believed, with apparent sincerity, that bringing soap to Africa was a form of moral uplift. He established a massive palm oil plantation in the Belgian Congo, a territory already infamous for the genocidal brutality of King Leopold II's regime, to secure the raw materials his soap factories needed. The conditions on those plantations were, by any measure, horrific: forced labor, violence, the systematic destruction of local economic systems. And the product that all of this suffering went into making was sold, back in Europe and America, as a symbol of cleanliness, purity, and civilizational progress. The irony is almost too complete to be real. The soap that was supposed to represent hygiene and moral virtue was being produced through one of the most morally contaminated supply chains in industrial history. But let's pull back from the colonial story for a moment, because the 19th century also saw soap at the center of a conflict that was more straightforwardly economic. And that reshaped the chemistry of the product itself in ways we're still living with today. The explosion of industrial soap production created ferocious competition among manufacturers, and that competition drove a relentless search for cheaper raw materials. Animal tallow, rendered beef and mutton fat, was the traditional base for most European soap, but tallow was expensive, and its supply was limited. Manufacturers began experimenting with alternative fats: palm oil from West Africa, coconut oil from the Pacific, cottonseed oil from the American South. Each of these substitutions changed the character of the soap being produced. Palm oil, in particular, produced a hard bar that lathered well and was significantly cheaper than tallow-based soap. Its adoption transformed the economics of soap manufacturing and created, as a side effect, one of the most consequential commodity trades of the 19th and early 20th centuries. The demand for palm oil drove European commercial and colonial expansion into West Africa, with a ferocity that had profound and lasting consequences for the people living there. There's a direct line, not a metaphorical one, but a literal, traceable, economic one, between the Victorian housewife buying a bar of soap at her local shop and the forced displacement of communities in the Niger Delta to make way for palm oil plantations. That line is uncomfortable. It's supposed to be. Meanwhile, on the scientific front, the 19th century also brought a discovery that would eventually transform soap's relationship to human health in ways that were genuine rather than ideological. In the 1840s, a Hungarian physician named Ignaz Semmelweis made an observation that should have changed medicine immediately, but instead was ignored for decades because it was too threatening to established medical authority. Semmelweis noticed that women giving birth in the maternity ward staffed by medical students and doctors had dramatically higher rates of childbed fever, a deadly postpartum infection, than women giving birth in the ward staffed by midwives. The difference, he eventually concluded, was that the doctors were coming directly from performing autopsies on cadavers and then delivering babies without washing their hands. He instituted a policy of hand washing with chlorinated lime solution before entering the maternity ward, and the death rate dropped immediately and dramatically. The medical establishment's response was not gratitude, it was hostility. Semmelweis' theory implied that doctors themselves were causing patient deaths, an idea so professionally threatening that it was easier to attack the messenger than accept the evidence. He was ridiculed, professionally marginalized, and eventually committed to a mental asylum, where he died in 1865, ironically, of an infection. It was only after Louis Pasteur and Joseph Lister developed germ theory in the 1860s and 1870s that Semmelweis' observations were finally vindicated. Germs, bacteria, cause disease. Disease spread through contact. Washing with soap disrupted that contact. The thing that soap actually did, mechanically, at a molecular level, surrounding and lifting away microorganisms along with dirt and grease, turned out to be one of the most powerful public health interventions in human history. And here is where the story of soap becomes genuinely, uncomplicatedly good, because once germ theory was established, and once hand washing with soap was understood as a genuine disease prevention tool, the public health consequences were extraordinary. Mortality rates from infectious diseases began to fall. Infant mortality, one of the great killers of the pre-modern world, declined significantly in societies where soap use became widespread. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, diseases that had killed millions across centuries, became less frequent and less deadly as hand washing with soap became normalized. The same product that had been used to justify colonial domination was, when properly understood and distributed, genuinely saving lives on a massive scale. That tension between soap as an instrument of ideology and soap as a genuine tool of human welfare never fully resolved. It simply became part of the object's complicated identity. A bar of soap can be, simultaneously, a genuine public health miracle and a prop in someone's story about who deserves to be considered fully human. It was both things then. In some ways, it remains both things now. So where does that leave us? Standing at a sink, most likely, reaching for something we don't think about. But maybe, after everything we've just walked through together, that automatic gesture deserves a second look. The world today uses somewhere in the region of 15 billion kilograms of soap every year. It is one of the most widely produced and widely distributed consumer products in human history. You can find it in the most remote villages in sub-Saharan Africa and in the most expensive hotels in Tokyo. It costs almost nothing in wealthy countries. And in the places where it's still inaccessible, where clean water is scarce and soap is genuinely unaffordable, children still die from diseases that a bar of soap and clean water could prevent. That last fact is worth sitting with. We've known for over 150 years, since Semmelweis, since Pasteur, since Lister, that hand washing with soap is one of the most effective public health interventions available to humanity. The evidence is not contested. The mechanism is understood. The cost is minimal. And yet, according to the World Health Organization, roughly 3 billion people worldwide still lack basic hand washing facilities with soap at home. Every year, hundreds of thousands of children under 5 die from diarrheal diseases and respiratory infections that hand washing could substantially reduce. We solved the chemistry thousands of years ago, We understood the public health science 150 years ago. The barrier that remains is not scientific, it's economic and political, which is to say, it's the same barrier that has always defined the history of soap. Not the question of whether it works, but the question of who gets access to it and on whose terms. That question exploded back into global consciousness in a way nobody anticipated in early 2020, when a novel coronavirus began spreading across the world and public health authorities, scrambling for interventions that could be immediately and universally implemented, landed on the same answer that Semmelweis had reached in a Vienna maternity ward in 1847. Wash your hands with soap for 20 seconds. It was, in one sense, almost absurdly simple advice for a crisis of that scale. And yet the global spike in soap sales, the videos of people learning proper hand-washing technique, the debates about soap availability in low-income communities, all of it was a sudden, vivid reminder that this ancient, unglamorous product still sat at the center of humanity's most fundamental negotiations with disease and death. The pandemic also, briefly, illuminated something that the soap industry had been quietly grappling with for years: the environmental cost of modern soap production. The palm oil that became such a crucial ingredient in industrial soap manufacturing in the 19th century is still a dominant raw material today. And the palm oil industry, concentrated primarily in Indonesia and Malaysia, has been responsible for some of the most extensive deforestation and habitat destruction on the planet. Rainforests cleared for palm plantations, orangutan populations devastated, indigenous communities displaced. The supply chain that runs from a tropical plantation to your bathroom cabinet is, in many cases, still deeply tangled with exploitation, different in form from the colonial extraction of the 19th century, but not entirely different in structure. Some soap manufacturers have responded to this with genuine reform, committing to sustainably sourced palm oil, investing in alternative ingredients, redesigning formulations. Others have responded primarily with greenwashing, the 21st century equivalent of the Pears soap advertisement, where the language of virtue and cleanliness is deployed to obscure a more complicated reality underneath. The more things change. And yet, and this is the part I keep coming back to, soap is also genuinely, undeniably, one of humanity's great achievements. Not because it was invented by a visionary genius in a flash of inspiration, but precisely because it wasn't. It was stumbled upon by anonymous workers in ancient Mesopotamia who were trying to clean wool. It was refined over millennia by craftspeople in Syria and Spain and France, who passed their knowledge down through generations without ever understanding the chemistry they were practicing. It was democratized by industrial chemists and factory owners, for complicated and often self-serving reasons, but democratized nonetheless. And it was vindicated, finally, by a Hungarian doctor who was laughed out of his profession for suggesting that doctors should wash their hands. That's not a heroic narrative in the conventional sense. There's no single inventor to celebrate, no single moment of triumph. It's messier than that. It's a story about accumulation, about knowledge building on knowledge, about a useful thing slowly becoming understood and then slowly becoming accessible, with enormous amounts of human suffering and human ingenuity mixed together along the way. Think about what that bar of soap actually contains, historically speaking. It contains the empirical knowledge of Mesopotamian textile workers from nearly 5,000 years ago. It contains the sophisticated chemistry of medieval Arab soap makers in Aleppo. It contains the Industrial Revolution's transformation of raw materials into affordable commodities. It contains Semmelweis's vindicated observation and Pasteur's germ theory and Lister's antiseptic surgery. It contains, more darkly, the labor of colonized people on plantations, the ideology of Victorian racial hierarchy, the machinery of empire. It is a very crowded bar of soap, and perhaps that's what makes it such a perfect lens for looking at how human civilization actually works. Not through the grand narratives of great men and decisive battles, but through the objects we touch every day without thinking. The things so ordinary, so ubiquitous, so completely woven into the fabric of daily life that we've stopped seeing them entirely. Every bar of soap on every sink in the world is a compressed history of human ingenuity and human failure, of science and exploitation, of genuine care and profound hypocrisy, of the slow, uneven, painfully incomplete process by which useful knowledge spreads across a species, and sometimes, not always, not equitably, but sometimes, makes life a little better for a few more people than it did before. You reached for it this morning without thinking. Now you know what you were reaching for.